Chapter Roman one half a lifetime ago, there lived in one of the Westmoreland Dales a single woman of the name of Susan Dixon. She was owner of the small farmhouse where she resided, and of some 30 or 40 acres of land by which it was surrounded. She had also an hereditary right to a sheepwalk, extending to the wild fells that overhang Blee Tarn in the language of the country. She was a stateswoman. Her house is yet to be seen on the Oxenfell Road between Skelwith and Kynaston. You go along a moorland track, made by the carts that occasionally came for turf from the Oxenfell. A brook babbles and brattles by the wayside, giving you a sense of companionship, which relieves the deep solitude in which this way is usually traversed some miles on this side of Kynaston. There is a farmstead, a grey stone house, and a square of farm buildings surrounding a green space of rough turf, in the midst of which stands a mighty funereal umbrageous yew making a solemn shadow, as of death, in the very heart and center of the light and heat of the brightest summer day on the side away from the house. This yard slopes down to a dark brown pool, which is supplied with fresh water from the overflowings of a stone cistern into which some rivulet of the brook before mentioned continually and melodiously falls, bubbling. The cattle drink out of this cistern. The household bring their pitchers and fill them with drinking water by a dilatory, yet pretty process. The water carrier brings with her a leaf of the houndstung fern, and inserting it in the crevice of the gray rock, makes a cool green spout for the sparkling stream. The house is no specimen at the present day of what it was in the lifetime of Susan Dixon. Then every small diamond pane in the windows glittered with cleanliness. You might have eaten off the floor, you could see yourself in the pewter plates. And the polished oaken armory, or dresser of the state kitchen, into which you entered. Few strangers penetrated further than this room. Once or twice, wandering tourists, attracted by the lonely picturesqueness of the situation and the exquisite cleanliness of the house itself, made their way into this house place, and offered money enough as they thought to tempt the hostess to receive them. As lodgers they would give no trouble. They said they would be out rambling or sketching all day long, would be perfectly content with a share of the food which she provided for herself, or would procure what they required from the waterhead inn at Kynaston. But no liberal sum, no fair words moved her. From her stony manner or her monotonous tone of indifferent refusal, no persuasion could induce her to show any more of the house than that first room. No appearance of fatigue procured for the weary an invitation to sit down and rest. And if one more bold and less delicate did so, without being asked, Susan stood by cold, and apparently deaf, or only replying by the briefest monosyllables, till the unwelcome visitor had departed. Yet those with whom she had dealings in the way of selling her cattle or her farm produce spoke of her as keen, after a bargain, a hard one to have to do with, and she never spared herself exertion or fatigue at market or in the field to make the most of her produce. She led the haymakers with her swift, steady rake and her noiseless evenness of motion. She was about among the earliest in the market, examining samples of oats, pricing them, and then turning with grim satisfaction to her own cleaner corn. She was served faithfully and long by those who were rather her fellow laborers than her servants. She was even and just in her dealings with them. If she was peculiar and silent, they knew her and knew that she might be relied on. Some of them had known her from her childhood, and deep in their hearts was an unspoken, almost unconscious pity for her, for they knew her story, though they never spoke of it. Yes, the time had been when that tall, gaunt, hard-featured, angular woman who never smiled and hardly ever spoke an unnecessary word had been a fine-looking girl, bright-spirited and rosy, and when the hearth at the Ewe-Nook had been as bright as she with family love and youthful hope and mirth. 50 or 51 years ago, William Dixon and his wife Margaret were alive, and Susan, their daughter, was about 18 years older than the only other child, a boy named after his father. William and Margaret Dixon were rather superior people of a character belonging, as far as I have seen, exclusively to the class of Westmoreland and Cumberland statesmen, just, independent, upright, not given to much speaking, kind-hearted, but not demonstrative, disliking change and new ways, and new people, sensible and shrewd, each household self-contained, and its members having little curiosity as to their neighbors, with whom they rarely met for any social intercourse save at the stated times of sheep shearing and Christmas, having a certain kind of sober pleasure in amassing money, which occasionally made them miserable, as they call miserly people up in the north in their old age, reading no light or ephemeral literature, but the grave, solid books brought round by the peddlers, such as the Paradise Lost and Regained, the Death of Abel, the Spiritual Quixote, and the Pilgrim's Progress, were to be found in nearly every house, the men occasionally going off, laking Roman 1e, playing Roman 1e, drinking for days together, and having to be hunted up by anxious wives who dared not leave their husbands to the chances of the wild, precipitous roads, but walked miles and miles, lantern in hand, in the dead of night, to discover and guide the solemn, drunken husband home, who had a dreadful headache the next day, and the day after that came forth as grave and sober, and virtuous looking as if there were no such thing as malt and spirituous liquors in the world, and who were seldom reminded of their misdoings by their wives, to whom such occasional outbreaks were as things of course, when once the immediate anxiety produced by them was over, such where such erreth characteristics of a class now, passing away from the face of the land, as their compeers the yeomen have done before them. Of such was William Dickson. He was a shrewd, clever farmer in his day and generation, when shrewdness was rather shown in the breeding and rearing of sheep and cattle than in the cultivation of land, owing to this character of his statesmen, from a distance from beyond Kendal, or from Borrowdale of greater wealth. Then he would send their sons to be farm servants for a year or two with him, in order to learn some of his methods before setting up on land of their own. When Susan, his daughter, was about 17, one Michael Hurst was farm servant at Eunuch. He worked with the master, and lived with the family, and was in all respects treated as an equal, except in the field. His father was a wealthy statesman at Whitburn up beyond Grasmere, and through Michael's servitude the families had become acquainted, and the Dicksons went over to the High Beck sheep-shearing, and the Hursts came down by Red Bank and Luffrig Tarn, and across the Oxenfell when there was the Christmastide feasting at Eunuch. The fathers strolled round the fields together, examined cattle and sheep, and looked knowing over each other's horses. The mothers inspected the dairies and household arrangements, each openly admiring the plans of the other, but secretly preferring their own. Both fathers and mothers cast a glance from time to time at Michael and Susan, who were thinking of nothing less than farm or dairy, but whose unspoken attachment was in all ways so suitable and natural a thing that each parent rejoiced over it, although with characteristic reserve. It was never spoken about, not even between husband and wife. Susan had been a strong, independent, healthy girl, a clever help to her mother, and a spirited companion to her father, more of a man in her, as he often said, than her delicate little brother ever would have. He was his mother's darling. Although she loved Susan well, there was no positive engagement between Michael and Susan. I doubt whether even plain words of love had been spoken when one wintertime Margaret Dickson was seized with inflammation consequent upon a neglected cold. She had always been strong and notable, and had been too busy to attend to the early symptoms of illness. It would go off, she said to the woman who helped in the kitchen, or if she did not feel better when they had got the hams and bacon out of hand, she would take some herbtia and nurse up a bit. But death could not wait till the hams and bacon were cured. He came on with rapid strides and shooting arrows of portentous agony. Susan had never seen illness, never knew how much she loved her mother, till now, when she felt a dreadful instinctive certainty that she was losing her. Her mind was thronged with recollections of the many times she had slighted her mother's wishes. Her heart was full of the echoes of careless and angry replies that she had spoken. What would she not now give to have opportunities of service and obedience, and trials of her patience and love for that dear mother who lay gasping in torture? And yet Susan had been a good girl and an affectionate daughter. The sharp pain went off and delicious ease came on, yet still her mother sunk in the midst of this languid peace. She was dying. She motioned Susan to her bedside, for she could only whisper. And then, while the father was out of the room, she spoke, as much to the eager, hungering eyes of her daughter, by the motion of her lips, as by the slow, feeble sounds of her voice. Susan, lass, thou must not fret. It is God's will, and thou wilt have a deal to do. Keep father straight if thou canst. And if he goes out Ulverstone ways, see that thou meet him before he gets to the old quarry. It's a dree bit for a man who has had a drop. As for Lyle, will here, the poor woman's face began to work, and her fingers to move nervously as they lay on the bedquilt. Lyle will miss me most of all. Father's often vexed with him because he's not a quick, strong lad. He is not my poor Lyle chap, and father thinks he's saucy, because he cannot always stomach oat cake and porridge. There's better than £3 in old black teapot on the top shelf of the cupboard. Just keep a piece of loaf bread by you, Susan dear, for Will to come to. When he's not taken his breakfast, I have maybe spoilt him, but there'll be no one to spoil him now. She began to cry a low, feeble cry, and covered up her face that Susan might not see her, that dear face, those precious moments, while yet the eyes could look out with love and intelligence. Susan laid her head down close by her mother's ear. Mother, ill take tent of, Will, mother, do you hear? He shall not want aught I can give or get for him, least of all the kind words, which you had ever ready for us both. Bless you, my own mother. Tholt promise me that, Susan, wilt thou? I can die easy if Tholt take charge of him, but he's hardly like other folk. He tries father at times, though I think father'll be tender of him, when I am gone for my sake. And Susan, there's one thing more I never spoke on it for fear of the bairn being called a telltale, but I just comforted him up. He vexes Michael at times, and Michael has struck him before now. I did not want to make a stir, but he's not strong, and a word from thee Susan will go a long way with Michael. Susan was as red now as she had been pale before. It was the first time that her influence over Michael had been openly acknowledged by a third person, and a flash of joy came athwart the solemn sadness of the moment. Her mother had spoken too much, and now came on the miserable faintness. She never spoke again coherently, but when her children and her husband stood by her bedside, she took Lyle Will's hand and put it into Susan's, and looked at her with imploring eyes. Susan clasped her arms round Will, and leaned her head upon his little curly one, and vowed within herself to be as a mother to him. Henceforward she was all in all to her brother. She was a more spirited and amusing companion to him than his mother had been from her greater activity, and perhaps also from her originality of character, which often prompted her to perform her habitual actions in some new and racy manner. She was tender to Lyle, Will when she was prompt and sharp with everybody else with Michael, most of all for somehow the girl felt that unprotected by her mother she must keep up her own dignity, and not allow her lover to see how strong a hold he had upon her heart. He called her hard and cruel, and left her so. And she smiled softly to herself, when his back was turned, to think how little he guessed how deeply he was loved. For Susan was merely comely and fine-looking. Michael was strikingly handsome, admired by all the girls for miles round, and quite enough of a country coxcomb to know it, and plume himself accordingly. He was the second son of his father. The eldest would have High Beck Farm, of course, but there was a good penny in the Kendall Bank in store for Michael. When harvest was over, he went to Chapel Langdale to learn to dance, and at night in his merry moods, he would do his steps on the flag floor of the Ewe-Nook kitchen, to the secret admiration of Susan, who had never learned dancing but who flouted him perpetually. Even while she admired in accordance with the rule she seemed to have made for herself about keeping him at a distance so long as he lived under the same roof with her. One evening he sulked at some saucy remark of hers. He sitting in the chimney corner with his arms on his knees and his head bent forwards, lazily gazing into the wood fire on the hearth, and luxuriating in rest after a hard day's labor. She sitting among the geraniums on the long low windows trying to catch the last slanting rays of the autumnal light to enable her to finish stitching a shirt collar for Will, who lounged full length on the flags at the other side of the hearth, to Michael poking the burning wood from time to time with a long hazel stick to bring out the leap of glittering sparks. And if you can dance a threesome reel, what good does it do? He asked, Susan looking askance at Michael, who had just been vaunting his proficiency. Does it help you plow, reap, or even climb the rocks to take a raven's nest? If I were a man, it'd be a shame to give in to such softness. If you were a man, you'd be glad to do anything which made the pretty girls stand round and admire. As they do to you, ho, Michael, that would not be my way o' being a man. What would then? Asked he, after a pause during which he had expected in vain that she would go on with her sentence. No answer. I should not like you as a man, Sussy. You'd be too hard and headstrong. Am I hard and headstrong? Asked she with as indifferent a tone as she could assume, but which yet had a touch of pique in it. His quick ear detected the inflection. No, Sussy, you're a willful at times, and that's right enough. I don't like a girl without spirit. There's a mighty pretty girl comes to the dancing class, but she is all milk and water. Her eyes never flash like yours. When you're put out, why, I can see them flame across the kitchen like a cat's in the dark. Now, if you were a man, I should feel queer before those looks of yours. As it is, I rather like them because what? Asked she, looking up and perceiving that he had stolen close up to her. Because I can make all right in this way, said he, kissing her suddenly. Can you? Said she, wrenching herself out of his grasp and panting half with rage. Take that by way of proof that making right is none so easy. And she boxed his ears pretty sharply. He went back to his seat, discomfited and out of temper. She could no longer see to look, even if her face had not burnt and her eyes dazzled, but she did not choose to move her seat, so she still preserved her stooping attitude and pretended to go on sewing. A leaner Hebthwaite may be milk and waiter muttered. He but confound thee, lad, what art thou doing? Exclaimed Michael, as a great piece of burning wood was cast into his face by an unlucky poke of Will's. Thou great lounging clumsy chap, ill teach thee better. And with one or two good round kicks, he sent the lad whimpering away into the back kitchen. When he had a little recovered himself from his passion, he saw Susan standing before him, her face looking strange and almost ghastly, by the reversed position of the shadows, arising from the firelight shining upwards right under it. I tell thee what, Michael, said she, that lad's motherless but not friendless. His own father leathers him, and why should not I when he's given me such a burn on my face? said Michael, putting up his hand to his cheek as if in pain. His father's his father, and there is not more to be said. But if he did burn thee it was by accident, and not o' purpose, as thou kicked him it's a mercy if his ribs are not broken. He howls loud enough I am sure I might ha' kicked many a lad twice as hard, and they'd near ha' said aught, but damn ye, but yon lad must needs cry out like a stuck pig, if one touches him, replied Michael sullenly. Susan went back to the windows and looked absently out of the window at the drifting clouds for a minute or two, while her eyes filled with tears. Then, she got up and made for the outer door which led into the back kitchen. Before she reached it, however, she heard a low voice whose music made her thrill say, Susan, Susan. Her heart melted within her, but it seemed like treachery to her poor boy, like faithlessness to her dead mother, to turn to her lover while the tears which he had caused to flow were yet unwiped on Will's cheeks. So she seemed to take no heed, but passed into the darkness, and guided by the sobs she found her way to where Willie sat crouched among the disused tubs and churns. Come out, why, me lad, and they went out into the orchard, where the fruit trees were bare of leaves, but ghastly in their tattered covering of grey moss, and the soughing November wind came with long sweeps over the fells, till it rattled among the crackling boughs underneath, which the brother and sister sat in the dark, he in her lap, and she hushing his head against her shoulder. Thou shouldst na play wi fire, it's a naughty trick, thoult suffer for it in worse ways, nor this, before thou'st done I'm afeard. I should ha hit thee twice as lungious kicks as Mike, if I'd been in his place. He did not hurt thee, I am sure, she assumed half as a question. Yes, but he Roman 999, he turned me quite sick, and he let his head fall languidly down on his sister's breast. Come lad, said she, anxiously be a man. It was not much that I saw why when first the red cow came, she kicked me far harder for offering to milk her, before her legs were tied, see, thee here's a peppermint drop. And ill make thee a pasty, tonight, only don't give way so, for it hurts me sore to think that Michael has done thee any harm, my pretty. Willie roused himself up and put back the wet and ruffled hair from his heated face, and he and Susan rose up, and hand in hand went towards the house, walking slowly and quietly. Except for a kind of sob, which Willie could not repress, Susan took him to the pump and washed his tear-stained face till she thought she had obliterated all traces of the recent disturbance, arranging his curls for him, and then she kissed him tenderly, and led him in, hoping to find Michael in the kitchen and make all straight between them. But the blaze had dropped down into darkness. The wood was a heap of grey ashes in which the sparks ran hither and thither. But even in the groping darkness, Susan knew by the sinking at her heart that Michael was not there. She threw another brand on the hearth, and lighted the candle, and sat down to her work in silence. Willie cowered on his stool, by the side of the fire, eyeing his sister from time to time, and sorry, and oppressed he knew not why, by the sight of her grave, almost stern face. No one came, they two were in the house, alone. The old woman who helped Susan with the household work had gone out for the night to some friend's dwelling, William Dixon. The father was up on the fells seeing after his sheep. Susan had no heart to prepare the evening meal. Sussy darling, are you angry with me, said Willie, in his little piping gentle voice. He had stolen up to his sister's side. I want never play with the fire again, and ill not cry. If Michael does kick me, only don't look so like dead mother, don't please. Don't, he exclaimed, hiding his face on her shoulder. I'm not angry, Willie said. She don't be feared on me. You want your supper, and you shall have it. And don't you be feared on Michael. He shall give reason for every hair of your head that he touches shall. When William Dixon came home, he found Susan and Willie sitting together hand in hand, and apparently pretty cheerful. He bade them go to bed, for that he would sit up for Michael. And the next morning when Susan came down, she found that Michael had started an hour before with the cart for lime. It was a long day's work. Susan knew it would be late, perhaps later than on the preceding night, before he returned, at any rate past her usual bedtime, and on no account would she stop up a minute beyond that hour in the kitchen. Whatever she might do in her bedroom, here she sat and watched till past midnight. And when she saw him coming up the brow with the carts, she knew full well, even in that faint moonlight, that his gait was the gait of a man in liquor. But though she was annoyed and mortified to find in what way he had chosen to forget her, the fact did not disgust or shock her, as it would have done many a girl even at that day who had not been brought up as Susan had among a class who considered it no crime, but rather a mark of spirit in a man to get drunk occasionally. Nevertheless, she chose to hold herself very high all the next day, when Michael was perforce obliged to give up any attempt to do heavy work, and hung about the outbuildings and farm in a very disconsolate and sickly state. Willie had far more pity on him than Susan. Before evening Willie and he were fast and on his side ostentatious. Friends Willie rode the horses down to water, Willie helped him to chop wood, Susan sat gloomily at her work, hearing an indistinct but cheerful conversation going on in the shippen, while the cows were being milked. She almost felt irritated with her little brother as if he were a traitor, and had gone over to the enemy in the very battle that she was fighting in his cause. She was alone with no one to speak to, while they prattled on regardless if she were glad or sorry. Soon Willie burst in, Susan, Susan, come with me, I've something so pretty to show you round the corner of the barn, run. He was dragging her along, half reluctant, half desirous of some change. In that weary day, round the corner of the barn, and caught hold of by Michael, who stood there awaiting her. Oh, Willie, cried she, you naughty boy, there is nothing pretty, what have you brought me here? For let me go, I want be held. Only one word, nay, if you wish it so much you may go, said Michael, suddenly loosing his hold as she struggled, but now she was free. She only drew off a step or two, murmuring something about Willie. You are going, then, said Michael, with seeming sadness. You won't hear me say a word of what is in my heart. How can I tell whether it is what I should like to hear, replied she, still drawing back. That is just what I want you to tell me. I want you to hear it, and then to tell me whether you like it or not. Well, you may speak, replied she, turning her back and beginning to plait the hem of her apron. He came close to her ear. I am sorry, I hurt Willie the other night. He has forgiven me, can you? You hurt him very badly, she replied, but you are right to be sorry. I forgive you. Stop, stop, said he, laying his hand upon her arm. There is something more I've got to say. I want you to be me. What is it they call it, Susan? I don't know, said she, half laughing, but trying to get away with all her might now. And she was a strong girl, but she could not manage it. You do me, what is it I want you to be? I tell you I don't know, and you had best be quiet, and just let me go in, or I shall think you're as bad now as you were last night. And how did you know what I was last night? It was past 12. When I came home, were you watching? Ah, Susan, be my wife. And you shall never have to watch for a drunken husband. If I were your husband, I would come straight home, and count every minute an hour till I saw your bonny face. Now, you know what I want you to be. I ask you to be my wife. Will you, my own dear Susan? She did not speak for some time, then she only said, ask father, and now, she was really off like a lapwing round the corner of the barn, and up in her own little room, crying with all her might before the triumphant smile had left Michael's face where he stood. The ask father was a mere form to be gone, though old Daniel Hurst and William Dixon had talked over what they could respectively give their children before this. And that was the parental way of arranging such matters, when the probable amount of worldly gear that he could give his child had been named by each father. The young folk, as they said, might take their own time in coming to the point which the old men, with the prescience of experience, saw they were drifting to. No need to hurry them, for they were both young, and Michael, though active enough, was too thoughtless. Old Daniel, said to be trusted with the entire management of a farm. Meanwhile, his father would look about him and see after all the farms that were to be let. Michael had a shrewd notion of this preliminary understanding between the fathers, and so felt less daunted than he might otherwise have done at making the application for Susan's hand. It was all right, there was not an obstacle, only a deal of good advice, which the lover thought might have as well been spared, and which, it must be confessed, he did not much attend to, although he assented to every part of it. Then Susan was called downstairs, and slowly came dropping into view down the steps which led from the two family apartments into the house place. She tried to look composed and quiet, but it could not be done. She stood side by side with her lover, with her head drooping, her cheeks burning, not daring to look up or move, while her father made the newly betrothed a somewhat formal address in which he gave his consent and many a piece of worldly wisdom. Besides, Susan listened as well as she could for the beating of her heart. But when her father solemnly and sadly referred to his own lost wife, she could keep from sobbing no longer, but throwing her apron over her face, she sat down on the bench by the dresser and fairly gave way to pent-up tears. Oh, how strangely sweet to be comforted, as she was comforted by tender caress and many a low-whispered promise of love. Her father sat by the fire thinking of the days that were gone. Willie was still out of doors, but Susan and Michael felt no one's presence or absence. Only knew they were together as betrothed husband and wife. In a week or two, they were formally told of the arrangements to be made in their favor. A small farm in the neighborhood happened to fall vacant, and Michael's father offered to take it for him and be responsible for the rent for the first year, while William Dixon was to contribute a certain amount of stock. And both fathers were to help towards the furnishing of the house. Susan received all this information in a quiet, indifferent way. She did not care much for any of these preparations which were to hurry her. Through the happy hours, she cared least of all for the money amount of dowry, and of substance it jarred on her to be made the confidant of occasional slight repinings of Michael's, as one by one, his future father-in-law set aside a beast or a pig for Susan's portion, which were not always the best animals of their kind upon the farm, but he also complained of his own father's stinginess, which somewhat, though not much alleviated Susan's, dislike to being awakened out of her pure dream of love to the consideration of worldly wealth. But in the midst of all this bustle, Willie moped and pined he had the same chord of delicacy running through his mind that made his body feeble and weak. He kept out of the way, and was apparently occupied in whittling and carving uncouth heads on hazel sticks in an outhouse. But he positively avoided Michael and shrunk away, even from Susan. She was too much occupied to notice this. At first Michael pointed it out to her, saying with a laugh, "Look at Willie, he might be a cast-off lover and jealous of me. He looks so dark and downcast at me." Michael spoke this jest out loud, and Willie burst into tears and ran out of the house. Let me go," said Susan, for her lover's arm was round her waist. "I must go to him. If he's fretting, I promised mother I would." She pulled herself away, and went in search of the boy. She sought in byre and barn through the orchard, where indeed in this leafless winter time there was no great concealment up into the room, where the wool was usually stored in the later summer. And at last she found him sitting at bay like some hunted creature up behind the woodstack. "What are ye gone for, lad, and me seeking you everywhere?" asked she breathless. "I did not know you would seek me. I've been away many a time, and no one has cared to seek me," said he, crying afresh. "Nonsense," replied Susan, "don't be so foolish, ye little good-for-naught." But she crept up to him in the hole he had made underneath the great brown sheafs of wood, and squeezed herself down by him. "What for should folks seek after you when you get away from them, whenever you can?" asked she. "They don't want me to stay. Nobody wants me if I go with father. He says I hinder more than I help. You used to like to have me with you, but now you've taken up with Michael, and you'd rather I was away, and I can just bide away, but I cannot stand Michael jeering at me. He's got you to love him, and that might serve him." "But I love you too, dearly, lad," said she, putting her arm round his neck. "Which one of us do you like best?" said he wistfully, after a little pause, putting her arm away so that he might look in her face and see if she spoke truth. She went very red. "You should not ask such questions. They are not fit for you to ask nor for me to answer." "But mother bade you love me," said he plaintively. "And so I do, and so I ever will do, lover, nor husband shall come betwixt thee and me. Lad, near a one of them, that I promise thee as I promised mother before in the sight of God. And with her hearkening now, if ever she can hearken to earthly word again, only I cannot abide to have thee fretting just because my heart is large enough for two. And tho't love me always. Always and ever, and the more tho't love Michael," said she, dropping her voice. "Ill try," said the boy, sighing, for he remembered many a harsh word and blow of which his sister knew nothing. She would have risen up to go away, but he held her tight for here, and now she was all his own, and he did not know when such a time might come again. So the two sat crouched up and silent, till they heard the horn blowing at the field gate, which was the summons home to any wanderers belonging to the farm, and at this hour of the evening signified that supper was ready. Then the two went in. Chapter Roman 2. Susan and Michael were to be married in April. He had already gone to take possession of his new farm, 3 or 4 miles away from Unukbut, that is neighboring according to the acceptation of the word, in that thinly populated district. When William Dixon fell Roman 99, he came home one evening complaining of headache and pains in his limbs, but seemed to loathe the posset which Susan prepared for him, the treacle posset, which was the homely country remedy against an incipient cold. He took to his bed with a sensation of exceeding weariness, and an odd, unusual looking back to the days of his youth, when he was a lad living with his parents in this very house. The next morning he had forgotten all his life since then, and did not know his own children, crying like a newly weaned baby for his mother to come and soothe away his terrible pain. The doctor from Coniston said it was the typhus fever, and warned Susan of its infectious character, and shook his head over his patient. There were no near friends to come and share her anxiety, only good kind old Peggy, who was faithfulness itself, and 1 or 2 laborers' wives who would fain have helped her had not their hands been tied by their responsibility to their own families. But somehow Susan neither feared nor flagged. As for fear, indeed, she had no time to give way to it, for every energy of both body and mind was required. Besides, the young have had too little experience of the danger of infection to dread it much. She did indeed wish from time to time that Michael had been at home to have taken Willie over to his father's at High Beck. But then again the lad was docile and useful to her, and his fecklessness in many things might make him harshly treated by strangers, so perhaps it was as well that Michael was away at Appleby Fair, or even beyond that gone into Yorkshire after horses. Her father grew worse, and the doctor insisted on sending over a nurse from Kynaston, not a professed nurse. Kynaston could not have supported such a one, but a widow who was ready to go where the doctor sent her for the sake of the payment. When she came, Susan suddenly gave way. She was felled by the fever herself, and lay unconscious for long weeks. Her consciousness returned to her one spring afternoon early. Spring, April, her wedding month, there was a little fire burning in the small corner grate, and the flickering of the blaze was enough for her to notice in her weak state. She felt that there was someone sitting on the window side of her bed behind the curtain, but she did not care to know who it was. It was even too great a trouble for her languid mind to consider who it was likely to be. She would rather shut her eyes and melt off again into the gentle luxury of sleep. The next time she wakened, the Kynaston nurse perceived her movement and made her a cup of tea, which she drank with eager relish, but still they did not speak, and once more Susan lay motionless, not asleep, but strangely pleasantly conscious of all the small chamber and household sounds: the fall of a cinder on the hearth, the fitful singing of the half-empty kettle, the cattle tramping out to field again, after they had been milked, the aged step on the creaking stair. Old Peggy's, as she knew it, came to her door. It stopped. The person outside listened for a moment, and then lifted the wooden latch and looked in. The watcher by the bedside arose and went to her. Susan would have been glad to see Peggy's face once more, but was far too weak to turn, so she lay and listened. "How is she?" whispered one trembling aged voice. "Better," replied the other. "She's been awake, and had a cup of tea. Shall do now." "Has she asked after him?" "Hush, no, she has not spoken a word." "Poor lass, poor lass." The door was shut. A weak feeling of sorrow and self-pity came over Susan. What was wrong? Whom had she loved? And dawning, slowly rose the sun of her former life, and all particulars were made distinct to her. She felt that some sorrow was coming to her, and cried over it before she knew what it was, or had strength enough to ask in the dead of night. And she had never slept. Aginch softly called to the watcher and asked, "Who?" "Who? What?" replied the woman with a conscious affright, ill-veiled by a poor assumption of ease. "Lie still, there's a darling, and go to sleep. Sleep's better for you than all the doctor's stuff." "Who?" repeated Susan. "Something is wrong." "Who?" "Oh dear," said the woman, "there's nothing wrong. Willie has taken the turn, and is doing nicely." "Father?" "Well, he's all right now," she answered, looking another way as if seeking for something. "Then it's Michael. Oh me, oh me." She set up a succession of weak, plaintive, hysterical cries, before the nurse could pacify her, by declaring that Michael had been at the house not 3 hours before to ask after her, and looked as well and as hearty as ever man. Roman 999, and you heard of no harm to him since? Inquired Susan. "Bless the lass, no, for sure I've near heard his name named, since I saw him go out of the yard, as stout a man as ever trod shoe leather." It was well, as the nurse said afterwards to Peggy, that Susan had been so easily pacified by the equivocating answer in respect to her father. If she had pressed the questions home in his case, as she did in Michael's, she would have learnt that he was dead, and buried more than a month before. It was well, too, that in her weak state of convalescence, which lasted long after this first day of consciousness, her perceptions were not sharp enough to observe the sad change that had taken place in Willie. His bodily strength returned, his appetite was something enormous, but his eyes wandered continually, his regard could not be arrested, his speech became slow, impeded, and incoherent. People began to say that the fever had taken away the little wit Willie Dixon had ever possessed, and that they feared that he would end in being a natural, as they call an idiot in the Dales. The habitual affection and obedience to Susan lasted longer than any other feeling that the boy had had previous to his illness, and perhaps this made her be the last to perceive what everyone else had long anticipated. She felt the awakening rude when it did come. It was in this wise. One June evening, she sat out of doors under the yew tree, knitting. She was pale still from her recent illness, and her languor, joined to the fact of her black dress, made her look more than usually interesting. She was no longer the buoyant, self-sufficient Susan. Equal to every occasion, the men were bringing in the cows to be milked, and Michael was about in the yard giving orders and directions with somewhat the air of a master, for the farm belonged of right to Willie, and Susan had succeeded to the guardianship of her brother Michael, and she were to be married as soon as she was strong enough. So perhaps his authoritative manner was justified, but the laborers did not like it. although they said little, they remembered a stripling on the farm, knowing far less than they did, and often glad to shelter his ignorance of all agricultural matters behind their superior knowledge. They would have taken orders from Susan with far more willingness, nay, Willie himself might have commanded them. And from the old hereditary feeling toward the owners of land, they would have obeyed him with far greater cordiality than they now showed to Michael. But Susan was tired with even 3 rounds of knitting, and seemed not to notice, or to care how things went on around her and Willipur Williother. He stood lounging against the dorsal enormously grown, and developed to be sure, but with restless eyes and ever-open mouth, and every now and then setting up a strange kind of howling cry, and then smiling vacantly to himself at the sound he had made as the 2 old laborers passed him. They looked at each other ominously and shook their heads. "Willie, darling," said Susan, "don't make that noise, it makes my head ache." She spoke feebly, and Willie did not seem to hear at any rate. He continued his howl from time to time. "Hold thy noise, Wilta," said Michael roughly, as he passed near him, and threatening him with his fist. Susan's back was turned to the pair. The expression of Willie's face changed from vacancy to fear, and he came shambling up to Susan, who put her arm round him, and as if protected by that shelter, he began making faces at Michael. Susan saw what was going on, and as if now first struck by the strangeness of her brother's manner, she looked anxiously at Michael. For an explanation, Michael was irritated at Willie's defiance of him, and did not mince the matter. "It's just that the fever has left him silly, never was as wise as other folk, and now I doubt if he will ever get right." Susan did not speak, but she went very pale and her lip quivered. She looked long and wistfully at Willie's face. As he watched the motion of the ducks in the great stable pool, he laughed softly to himself every now and then. "Willie likes to see the ducks go overhead," said Susan, instinctively, adopting the form of speech she would have used to a young child. Willie boo," he replied, clapping his hands and avoiding her eye. "Speak properly," Willie said. Susan, making a strong effort at self-control, and trying to arrest his attention. "You know who I am, tell me my name." She grasped his arm, almost painfully tight to make him attend. Now he looked at her, and for an instant a gleam of recognition quivered over his face. But the exertion was evidently painful, and he began to cry at the vainness of the effort to recall her name. He hid his face upon her shoulder with the old, affectionate trick of manner. She put him gently away, and went into the house, into her own little bedroom. She locked the door, and did not reply at all to Michael's calls, for her hardly spoke to old Peggy, who tried to tempt her out to receive some homely sympathy. And through the open easement, there still came the idiotic sound of Willie boo, Willie boo. Chapter Roman 3. After the stun of the blow came the realization of the consequences. Susan would sit for hours trying patiently to recall and piece together fragments of recollection and consciousness in her brother's mind. She would let him go and pursue some senseless bit of play and wait until she could catch his eye or his attention again, when she would resume her self-imposed task. Michael complained that she never had a word for him, or a minute of time to spend with him now, but she only said she must try while there was yet a chance to bring back her brother's lost wits. As for marriage in this state of uncertainty, she had no heart to think of it. Then Michael stormed and absented himself for 2 or 3 days, but it was of no use when he came back. He saw that she had been crying till her eyes were all swollen up, and he gathered from Peggy's scoldings, which she did not spare him, that Susan had eaten nothing since he went away, but she was as inflexible as ever. "Not just yet, only not just yet, and don't say again that I do not love you," said she, suddenly hiding herself in his arms. And so matters went on through August. The crop of oats was gathered in the wheat field, was not ready as yet, when one fine day Michael drove up in a borrowed shandry, and offered to take Willie a ride. His manner, when Susan asked him where he was going to, was rather confused, but the answer was straight and clear enough. He had business in Ambleside. He would never lose sight of the lad, and have him back safe and sound before dark, so Susan let him go. Before night they were at home again, Willie in high delight at a little rattling paper windmill that Michael had bought for him in the street, and striving to imitate this new sound with perpetual buzzings. Michael, too, looked pleased. Susan knew the look, although afterwards she remembered that he had tried to veil it from her, and had assumed a grave appearance of sorrow whenever he caught her eye. He put up his horse, for although he had 3 miles further to go, the moon was up, the bonny harvest moon, and he did not care how late he had to drive on such a road by such a light. After the supper, which Susan had prepared for the travelers, was over, Peggy went upstairs to see Willie safe in bed, for he had to have the same care taken of him that a little child of 4 years old requires. Michael drew near to Susan. "Susan," said he, "I took Will to see Dr. Preston at Kendal. He's the first doctor in the county. I thought it were better for us for you to know at once what chance there were for him." "Well," said Susan, looking eagerly up. She saw the same strange glance of satisfaction, the same instant change to apparent regret and pain. "What did he say?" said she. "Speak, can't you?" "He said he would never get better of his weakness." "Never?" "No, never. It's a long word and hard to bear. And there's worse to come, dearest. The doctor thinks he will get badder from year to year. And he said if he was us Yao would send him off in time to Lancaster Asylum. They've ways they're both of keeping such people in order. And making them happy. I only tell you what he said," continued he, seeing the gathering storm in her face. There was no harm in his saying it, she replied, with great self-constraint, forcing herself to speak coldly, instead of angrily. "Folk is welcome to their opinions." They sat silent for a minute or two, her breast heaving with suppressed feeling. "He's counted a very clever man," said Michael at length. "He may be. He's none of my clever men, nor am I going to be guided by him, whatever he may think, and I don't thank them that went and took my poor lad to have such harsh notions formed about him. If I'd been there I could have called out the sense that is in him. Well, I'll not say more tonight, Susan. You're not taking it rightly, and I'd best be gone, and leave you to think it over. I'll not deny they are hard words to hear, but there's sense in them as I take it, and I reckon y'all have to come to 'em. Anyhow, it's a bad way of thanking me for my pains, and I don't take it well in you, Susan," said he, getting up as if offended. "Michael, I am beside myself with sorrow. Don't blame me if I speak sharp. He and me is the only ones you see, and mother did so charge me to have a care of him. And this is what he's come to, poor lile chap." She began to cry, and Michael to comfort her with caresses. "Don't," said she, "it's no use trying to make me forget poor Willie. Is a natural. I could hate myself for being happy with you, even for just a little minute. Go away, and leave me to face it out. And y'all think it over, Susan, and remember what the doctor says." "I can't forget," said she. She meant she could not forget what the doctor had said about the hopelessness of her brother's case. Michael had referred to the plan of sending Willie to an asylum or madhouse, as they were called in that day, and placed the idea had been gathering force in Michael's mind. For some time, he had talked it over with his father, and secretly rejoiced over the possession of the farm and land, which would then be his in fact if not in law by right of his wife. He had always considered the good penny her father could give her in his catalogue of Susan's charms and attractions. But of late, he had grown to esteem her, as the heiress of Eunuch. He too should have land like his brotherland, to possess, to cultivate, to make profit from, to bequeath. For some time, he had wondered that Susan had been so much absorbed in Willie's present that she had never seemed to look forward to his future state. Michael had long felt the boy to be a trouble, but of late he had absolutely loathed him. His gibbering, his uncouth gestures, his loose shambling gait all irritated Michael inexpressibly. He did not come near the eunuch for a couple of days. He thought that he would leave her time to become anxious to see him. And reconciled to his plan, they were strange, lonely days to Susan. They were the first she had spent face to face with the sorrows that had turned her from a girl into a woman, for hitherto Michael had never let 24 hours pass by without coming to see her, since she had had the fever. Now that he was absent, it seemed as though some cause of irritation was removed from Will, who was much more gentle and tractable than he had been for many weeks. Susan thought that she observed him making efforts at her bidding, and there was something piteous in the way in which he crept up to her and looked wistfully in her face, as if asking her to restore him the faculties that he felt to be wanting. "I never will let thee go, lad, never. There's no knowing where they would take thee to, or what they would do with thee, as it says in the Bible, not, but death shall part thee and me." The countryside was full in those days of stories of the brutal treatment offered to the insane, stories that were in fact but too well founded, and the truth of one of which only would have been a sufficient reason for the strong prejudice existing against all such places. Each succeeding hour that Susan passed alone, or with the poor affectionate lad for her sole companion, served to deepen her solemn resolution never to part with him. So when Michael came, he was annoyed and surprised by the calm way in which she spoke, as if following Dr. Preston's advice was utterly and entirely out of the question. He had expected nothing less than a consent, reluctant it might be, but still a consent, and he was extremely irritated. He could have repressed his anger, but he chose rather to give way to it, thinking that he could thus best work upon Susan's affection, so as to gain his point. But somehow he overreached himself, and now he was astonished in his turn at the passion of indignation that she burst into. "Thou wilt not bide in the same house with him, say'st thou? There's no need for thy biding, as far as I can tell. There's solemn reason why I should bide with my own flesh and blood, and keep to the word I pledged my mother on her deathbed. But as for thee, there's no tie that I know on to keep thee fro going to America or botany. Bay this very night, if that were thy inclination. I will have no more of your threats. To make me send my bairn away, if thou marry me, tholt help me to take charge of Willie. If thou doesn't choose to marry me on those terms, I can snap my fingers at thee, never fear, I am not so far gone in love as that. But I will not have thee if thou sayst in such a hectoring way that Willie must go out of the house, and the house, his own too, before tholt set foot in it. Willie bides here, and I bide with him. Thou hast maybe spoken a word too much, said Michael, pale with rage. If I am free as thou sayst to go to Canada or botany, bay, I reckon I'm free to live where I like. And that will not be with a natural who may turn into a madman some day, for aught I know. Choose between him and me, sussy, for I swear to thee thou shan't have both. I have chosen, said Susan, now perfectly composed, and still whatever comes of it I bide with Willie. Very well, replied Michael, trying to assume an equal composure of manner. Then I'll wish you a very good night. He went out of the house door half expecting to be called back again. But instead he heard a hasty step inside, and a bolt drawn. Hugh, said he to himself, I think I must leave my lady alone for a week or two, and give her time to come to her senses. Shall not find it so easy, as she thinks, to let me go. So he went past the kitchen window in nonchalant style, and was not seen again at Yew for some weeks. How did he pass the time for the first day or two? He was unusually cross with all things and people that came athwart him. Then wheat harvest began, and he was busy and exultant about his heavy crop. Then a man came from a distance to bid for the lease of his farm, which by his father's advice had been offered for sale, as he himself was so soon likely to remove to the Yew. He had so little idea that Susan really would remain firm to her determination, that he at once began to haggle with the man who came after his farm, showed him the crop just got in, and managed skillfully enough to make a good bargain for himself. Of course the bargain had to be sealed at the public house, and the companions he met with there soon became friends enough to tempt him into Langdale, where again he met with a leaner Hebthwaite. How did Susan pass the time for the first day? Or so she was too angry and offended to cry. She went about her household duties in a quick, sharp, jerking, yet absent way, shrinking one moment from, while overwhelming him with remorseful caresses the next. The third day of Michael's absence, she had the relief of a good fit of crying. And after that she grew softer and more tender. She felt how harshly she had spoken to him, and remembered how angry she had been. She made excuses for him. It was no wonder, she said to herself, that he had been vexed with her, and no wonder he would not give in when she had never tried to speak gently or to reason with him. She was to blame, and she would tell him so, and tell him once again all that her mother had bade her to be to Willie, and all the horrible stories she had heard about madhouses, and he would be on her side at once. And so she watched for his coming, intending to apologize as soon as ever she saw him. She hurried over her household work in order to sit quietly at her sewing and hear the first distant sound of his well-known step or whistle. But even the sound of her flying needle seemed too loud. Perhaps she was losing an exquisite instant of anticipation, so she stopped sewing and looked longingly out through the geranium leaves in order that her eye might catch the first stir of the branches in the woodpath, by which he generally came now, and then a bird might spring out of the covert. Otherwise the leaves were heavily still. In the sultry weather of early autumn then she would take up her sewing, and with a spasm of resolution, she would determine that a certain task should be fulfilled before she would again allow herself the poignant luxury of expectation. Sick at heart was she when the evening closed in and the chances of that day diminished, yet she stayed up longer than usual, thinking that if he were coming, if he were only passing along the distant road, the sight of a light in the window might encourage him to make his appearance even at that late hour, while seeing the house all darkened and shut up might quench any such intention. Very sick and weary at heart, she went to bed too desolate and despairing to cry or make any moan, but in the morning hope came afresh. Another day, another chance. And so it went on for weeks. Peggy understood her young mistress' sorrow full well, and respected it by her silence on the subject. Willie seemed happier now that the irritation of Michael's presence was removed, for the poor idiot had a sort of antipathy to Michael, which was a kind of heart's echo to the repugnance in which the latter held him altogether. Just at this time, Willie was the happiest of the three. As Susan went into Coniston to sell her butter one Saturday, some inconsiderate person told her that she had seen Michael Hurst the night before. I said inconsiderate, but I might rather have said unobservant, for anyone who had spent half an hour in Susan Dixon's company might have seen that she disliked having any reference made to the subjects nearest her heart. Were they joyous or grievous now? She went a little paler than usual, and she had never recovered her color since she had had the fever, and tried to keep silence, but an irrepressible pang forced out the question. Where? At Thomas Applethwaite's in Langdale, they had a kind of harvest home, and he were there among the young folk and very thick why Nellie Hebthwaite old Thomas, niece Tholt have to look after him, a bit Susan. She neither smiled nor sighed. The neighbor who had been speaking to her was struck with the grey stillness of her face. Susan herself felt how well her self-command was obeyed by every little muscle, and said to herself in her Spartan manner, I can bear it without either wincing or blenching. She went home early at a tearing, passionate pace, trampling, and breaking through all obstacles of briar or bush. Willie was moping in her absence, hanging listlessly on the farmyard gate to watch for her. When he saw her, he set up one of his strange, inarticulate cries, of which she was now learning the meaning, and came towards her with his loose, galloping run head, and limbs all shaking and wagging with pleasant excitement. Suddenly she turned from him and burst into tears. She sat down on a stone by the wayside not 100 yards from home, and buried her face in her hands, and gave way to a passion of pent-up sorrow so terrible and full of agony were her low cries that the idiot stood by her aghast and silent, all his joy gone for the time. But, not like her joy turned into ashes, some thought struck him. Yes, the sight of her woe made him think great as the exertion was. He ran, and stumbled, and shambled home, buzzing with his lips. All the time, she never missed him. He came back in a trice, bringing with him his cherished paper windmill, bought on that fatal day, when Michael had taken him into Kendal to have his doom of perpetual idiocy pronounced. He thrust it into Susan's face, her hands, her lap, regardless of the injury his frail plaything thereby received. He leapt before her to think how he had cured all heart sorrow, buzzing louder than ever. Susan looked up at him, and that glance of her sad eyes sobered him. He began to whimper, he knew not why, and she, now comforter in her turn, tried to soothe him by twirling his windmill, but it was broken. It made no noise, it would not go round. This seemed to afflict Susan more than him. She tried to make it right, although she saw the task was hopeless, and while she did so, the tears rained down unheeded from her bent head on the paper toy. It won't do, said she at last, it will never do again, and somehow she took the accident and her words as omens of the love that was broken, and that she feared could never be pieced together more. She rose up and took Willie's hand, and the two went slowly into the house. To her surprise, Michael Hurst sat in the houseplace. Houseplace is a sort of better kitchen where no cookery is done, but which is reserved for state occasions. Michael had gone in there because he was accompanied by his only sister, a woman older than himself, who was well married beyond Keswick and who now came for the first time to make acquaintance with Susan. Michael had primed his sister with his wishes regarding Will and the position in which he stood with Susan, and arriving at Eunuch, in the absence of the latter, he had not scrupled to conduct his sister into the guest room, as he held Mrs. Gale's worldly position in respect and admiration, and therefore wished her to be favorably impressed with all the signs of property, which he was beginning to consider as Susan's greatest charms. He had secretly said to himself that if Eleanor Hebthwaite and Susan Dixon were equal in point of riches, he would sooner have Eleanor by far. He had begun to consider Susan as a termagant, and when he thought of his intercourse with her, recollections of her somewhat warm and hasty temper came far more readily to his mind than any remembrance of her generous, loving nature. And now she stood face to face with him, her eyes tear-swollen, her garments dusty, and here and there torn, in consequence of her rapid progress through the bushy bypaths. She did not make a favorable impression on the well-clad Mrs. Gale, dressed in her best silk gown and therefore unusually susceptible to the appearance of another, nor were Susan's manners gracious or cordial. How could they be, when she remembered what had passed between Michael and herself? The last time they met, for her penitence had faded away under the daily disappointment of these last weary weeks. But she was hospitable in substance. She bade Peggy hurry on the kettle, and busied herself among the teacups, thankful that the presence of Mrs. Gale as a stranger would prevent the immediate recurrence to the one subject, which she felt must be present in Michael's mind, as well as in her own. But Mrs. Gale was withheld by no such feelings of delicacy. She had come red-primed with the case, and had undertaken to bring the girl to reason. There was no time to be lost. It had been prearranged between the brother and sister that he was to stroll out into the farmyard before his sister introduced the subject, but she was so confident in the success of her arguments that she must needs have the triumph of a victory as soon as possible, and accordingly, she brought a hailstorm of good reasons to bear upon Susan. Susan did not reply for a long time. She was so indignant at this intermeddling of a stranger in the deep family sorrow and shame. Mrs. Gale thought she was gaining the day, and urged her arguments more pitilessly. Even Michael winced for Susan, and wondered at her silence. He shrank out of sight and into the shadow, hoping that his sister might prevail, but annoyed at the hard way in which she kept putting the case. Suddenly, Susan turned round from the occupation she had pretended to be engaged in, and said to him in a low voice, which yet not only vibrated itself, but made its hearers thrill through all their obtuseness. Michael Hurst, does your sister speak truth, think you? Both women looked at him for his answer, Mrs. Gale, without anxiety, for had she not said the very words they had spoken together? Before had she not used the very arguments that he himself had suggested? Susan, on the contrary, looked to his answer as settling her doom for life, and in the gloom of her eyes you might have read more despair than hope. He shuffled his position, he shuffled in his words. What is it you ask? My sister has said many things. I ask you, said Susan, trying to give a crystal clearness both to her expressions and her pronunciation, if knowing as you do how Will is afflicted you will help me to take that charge of him, which I promised my mother on her deathbed that I would do, and which means that I shall keep him always with me, and do all in my power to make his life happy. If you will do this, I will be your wife, if not I remain unwed. But he may get dangerous. He can be, but a trouble. His being here is a pain to you, Susan, not a pleasure. I ask you for either yes or no, said she, a little contempt at his, evading her question mingling with her tone. He perceived it, and it nettled him. And I have told you, I answered your question. The last time I was here, I said, I would near keep house with an idiot, no more. I will, so now you've got your answer. I have said, Susan, and she sighed deeply. Come now, said Mrs. Gale, encouraged by the sigh. One would think you don't love Michael, Susan, to be so stubborn in yielding to what I am sure would be best for the lad. Oh, she does not care for me, said Michael. I don't believe she ever Roman 999. Don't I, haven't I, asked Susan, her eyes blazing out fire. She left the room directly and sent Peggy in to make the tea, and catching at Will, who was lounging about in the kitchen, she went upstairs with him and bolted herself in, straining the boy to her heart, and keeping almost breathless lest any noise she made might cause him to break out into the howls and sounds which she could not bear that those below should hear. A knock at the door. It was Peggy. He wants for to see you, to wish you good-bye. I cannot come, oh Peggy, send them away. It was her only cry for sympathy, and the old servant understood it. She sent them away somehow, not politely, as I have been given to understand. Good, go with them, said Peggy, as she grimly watched their retreating figures were rid of bad rubbish anyhow. And she turned into the house with the intention of making ready some refreshment for Susan after her hard day at the market and her harder evening. But in the kitchen, to which she passed through the empty house-place, making a face of contemptuous dislike at the used teacups and fragments of a meal, yet standing there she found Susan with her sleeves tucked up, and her working apron on, busied in preparing to make clapbread, one of the hardest and hottest domestic tasks of a daleswoman. She looked up and first met, and then avoided Peggy's eye. It was too full of sympathy. Her own cheeks were flushed, and her own eyes were dry and burning. Where's the board, Peggy? We need clapbread, and I reckon I've time to get through with it tonight. Her voice had a sharp, dry tone in it, and her motions a jerking angularity about them. Peggy said nothing, but fetched her all that she needed. Susan beat her cakes thin with vehement force, as she stooped over them, regardless even of the task in which she seemed so much occupied. She was surprised by a touch on her mouth of something what she did not see at first. It was a cup of tea, delicately sweetened and cooled, and held to her lips. When exactly ready by the faithful old woman, Susan held it off a hand's breadth, and looked into Peggy's eyes, while her own filled with the strange relief of tears. Lass, said Peggy solemnly, thou hast done well. It is not long to bide, and then the end will come. But you are very old, Peggy, said Susan, quivering. It is but a day sin I were young, replied Peggy. But she stopped the conversation by again pushing the cup with gentle force to Susan's dry and thirsty lips. When she had drunken, she fell again to her labor, Peggy, heating the hearth and doing all that she knew would be required, but never speaking another word. Willie basked close to the fire, enjoying the animal luxury of warmth, for the autumn evenings were beginning to be chilly. It was 1 o'clock before they thought of going to bed on that memorable night. Chapter Roman 4. The vehemence with which Susan Dixon threw herself into occupation could not last for ever. Times of languor and remembrance would come at times, when she recurred with a passionate yearning to bygone days, the recollection of which was so vivid and delicious that it seemed as though it were the reality and the present bleak bareness the dream she smiled anew at the magical sweetness of some touch or tone which in memory she felt and heard and drank the delicious cup of poison, although at the very time she knew what the consequences of racking pain would be. This time last year thought she we went nutting Toj this very day, last year just such a day as today purple and gold, were the lights on the hills, the leaves were just turning brown here, and there on the sunny slopes. The stubble fields looked tawny down in a cleft of yon purple. Slatterock the beck fell like a silver glancing thread, all just as it is today, and he climbed the slender swaying nut trees, and bent the branches for me to gather, or made a passage through the hazel copses from time to time, claiming a toll who could have thought he loved me so little how. Or as the evening closed in, she would allow herself to imagine that she heard his coming step just that she might recall time, feeling of exquisite delight, which had passed by without the dew, and passionate relish at the time. Then she would wonder how she could have had strength, the cruel self-piercing strength, to say what she had done to stab himself with that stern resolution of which the seer would remain till her dying day. It might have been right. But as she sickened, she wished she had not instinctively chosen the right, how luxurious a life, haunted by no stern sense of duty, must be. And many led this kind of life. Why could not she owe for 1 hour again of his sweet company? If he came now, she would agree to whatever he proposed. It was a fever of the mind, she passed through it, and came out healthy if weak. She was capable once more of taking pleasure in following an unseen guide through briar and brake. She returned with tenfold affection to her protecting care of Willie. She acknowledged to herself that he was to be her all in life. She made him her constant companion for his sake as the real owner of Eunuch. And she, as his steward and guardian, she began that course of careful saving and that love of acquisition which afterwards gained for her the reputation of being miserly. She still thought that he might regain a scanty portion of sense enough to require some simple pleasures and excitement, which would cost money, and money should not be wanting. Peggy rather assisted her in the formation of her parsimonious habits than otherwise. Economy was the order of the district, and a certain degree of respectable avarice, the characteristic of her age. Only Willie was never stinted nor hindered of anything that the two women thought could give him pleasure for want of money. There was one gratification which Susan felt was needed for the restoration of her mind to its more healthy state, after she had passed through the whirling fever, when duty was as nothing and anarchy reigned, a gratification that somehow was to be her last burst of unreasonableness, of which she knew and recognized pain as the sure consequence. She must see him once more herself unseen. The week before the Christmas of this memorable year, she went out in the dusk of the early winter evening, wrapped close in shawl and cloak. She wore her dark shawl under her cloak, putting it over her head in lieu of a bonnet, for she knew that she might have to wait long in concealment. Then she tramped over the wet fell path, shut in by misty rain for miles and miles, till she came to the place where he was lodging, a farmhouse in Langdale, with a steep stony lane leading up to it. This lane was entered by a gate out of the main road, and by the gate were a few bushes thorns, but of them the leaves had fallen, and they offered no concealment. An old wreck of a yew tree grew among them, however, and underneath that Susan cowered down, shrouding her face, of which the color might betray her, with a corner of her shawl. Long did she wait, cold and cramped, she became too damp and stiff to change her posture readily. And after all, he might never come, but she would wait till daylight if need were, and she pulled out a crust with which she had providently supplied herself. The rain had ceased, a dull, still brooding. Weather had succeeded. It was a night to hear distant sounds. She heard horses' hoofs striking and splashing in the stones, and in the pools of the road at her back 2 horses, not well ridden or evenly guided as she could tell. Michael Hurst and a companion drew near, not tipsy, but not sober. They stopped at the gate to bid each other a maudlin farewell. Michael stooped forward to catch the latch with the hook of the stick which he carried. He dropped the stick, and it fell with one end close to Susan. Indeed, with the slightest change of posture, she could have opened the gate for him. He swore a great oath, and struck his horse with his closed fist, as if that animal had been to blame. Then he dismounted, opened the gate, and fumbled about for his stick. When he had found it, Susan had touched the other end. His first use of it was to flog his horse well, and she had much ado to avoid its kicks and plunges. Then, still swearing, he staggered up the lane, for it was evident he was not sober enough to remount. By daylight Susan was back, and at her daily labors at Eunuch. When the spring came, Michael Hurst was married to a leaner Hebthwaite. Others too were married, and christenings made their firesides merry and glad, or they travelled, and came back after long years with many wondrous tales. More rarely perhaps a dalesman changed his dwelling, But to all households more change came than to Eunuch there. The seasons came round with monotonous sameness, or if they brought mutation, it was of a slow and decaying and depressing kind. Old Peggy died, her silent sympathy concealed under much roughness, was a loss to Susan Dixon. Susan was not yet 30 when this happened, but she looked a middle-aged, not to say an elderly woman. People affirmed that she had never recovered her complexion since that fever a dozen years ago, which killed her father and left Will Dixon an idiot. But besides her gray sallowness, the lines in her face were strong and deep, and hard. The movements of her eyeballs were slow and heavy. The wrinkles at the corners of her mouth and eyes were planted firm, and sure not an ounce of unnecessary flesh was there on her bones. Every muscle started strong and ready for use. She needed all this bodily strength to a degree that no human creature now Peggy was dead knew of, for Willie had grown up large and strong in body and in general docile enough in mind. But every now and then he became first moody, and then violent. These paroxysms lasted but a day or two, and it was Susan's anxious care to keep their very existence hidden and unknown. It is true that occasional passers-by on that lonely road heard sounds at night of knocking about, of furniture blows and cries, as of some tearing demon within the solitary farmhouse. But these fits of violence usually occurred in the night, and whatever had been their consequence, Susan had tidied and redded up all signs of aught unusual before the morning, for above all, she dreaded lest someone might find out in what danger and peril she occasionally was, and might assume a right to take away her brother from her care. The one idea of taking charge of him had deepened and deepened with years. It was graven into her mind as the object for which she lived. The sacrifice she had made for this object only made it more precious to her. Besides, she separated the idea of the docile, affectionate, loutish, indolent Will, and kept it distinct from the terror which the demon that occasionally possessed him inspired her with. The one was her flesh and her blood, the child of her dead mother. The other was some fiend who came to torture and convulse the creature she so loved. She believed that she fought her brother's battle in holding down those tearing hands, in binding, whenever she could, those uplifted, restless arms, prompt and prone to do mischief. All the time she subdued him with her cunning or her strength. She spoke to him in pitying murmurs, or abused the third person, the fiendish enemy, in no unmeasured tones. Towards morning, the paroxysm was exhausted, and he would fall asleep, perhaps only to waken with evil and renewed vigor. But when he was laid down, she would sally out to taste the fresh air, and to work off her wild sorrow in cries and mutterings to herself. The early laborers saw her gestures at a distance, and thought her as crazed as the idiot brother who made the neighborhood a haunted place. But did any chance person call at Eunuch later on in the day, he would find Susan Dixon cold, calm, collected, her manner curt, her wits keen. Once this fit of violence lasted longer than usual. Susan's strength, both of mind and body, was nearly worn out. She wrestled in prayer that somehow it might end before she too was driven mad, or worse, might be obliged to give up life's aim and consign Willie to a madhouse. From that moment of prayer, as she afterwards superstitiously thought, Willie comedaned, then he droopedan, then he sank, and, last of all, he died in reality from physical exhaustion. But he was so gentle and tender, as he lay on his dying bed. Such strange childlike gleams of returning intelligence came over his face, long after the power to make his dull, inarticulate sounds had departed, that Susan was attracted to him by a stronger tie than she had ever felt before. It was something to have even an idiot loving her with dumb, wistful animal affection, something to have any creature looking at her with such beseeching eyes, imploring protection from the insidious enemy stealing on. And yet she knew that to him death was no enemy, but a true friend restoring light and health to his poor clouded mind. It was to her that death was an enemy, to her the survivor. When Willie died, there was no one to love her. Worse doom still, there was no one left on earth for her to love. You now know why no wandering tourist could persuade her to receive him as a lodger, why no tired traveler could melt her heart to afford him rest and refreshment, why long habits of seclusion had given her a moroseness of manner, and how care for the interests of another had rendered her keen and miserly. But there was a third act in the drama of her life. Chapter Roman 5. In spite of Peggy's prophecy that Susan's life should not seem long, it did seem wearisome and endless, as the years slowly uncoiled their monotonous circles. To be sure, she might have made change for herself, but she did not care to do it. It was indeed more than not caring, which merely implies a certain degree of vis inerti to be subdued before an object can be attained, and that the object itself does not seem to be of sufficient importance to call out the requisite energy. On the contrary, Susan exerted herself to avoid change and variety. She had a morbid dread of new faces, which originated in her desire to keep poor dead Willie's state a profound secret, She had a contempt for new customs, and indeed her old ways prospered so well under her active hand and vigilant eye that it was difficult to know how they could be improved upon. She was regularly present in Kynaston market with the best butter and the earliest chickens of the season. Those were the common farm produce that every farmer's wife about had to sell. But Susan, after she had disposed of the more feminine articles, turned to, on the man's side, a better judge of a horse or cow there was not in all the country. Round Yorkshire itself might have attempted to jockey her, and would have failed her corn was sound, and clean her potatoes well preserved to the latest spring. People began to talk of the hoards of money Susan Dixon must have laid up somewhere, and one young ne'er-do-weel of a farmer's son undertook to make love to the woman of 40, who looked 55 if a day he made up to her, by opening a gate on the road path home. As she was riding on a barebacked horse her purchase not an hour ago, she was off before him refusing his civility. But the remounting was not so easy, and rather than fail she did not choose to attempt it, she walked, and he walked alongside, improving his opportunity, which, as he vainly thought, had been consciously granted to him. As they drew near Eunuch, he ventured on some expression of a wish to keep company with her. His words were vague, and clumsily arranged. Susan turned round and coolly asked him to explain himself. He took courage as he thought of her reputed wealth, and expressed his wishes this second time. Pretty plainly to his surprise, the reply she made was in a series of smart strokes across his shoulders, administered through the medium of a supple hazel switch. Take that, said she, almost breathless, to teach thee how thou darest make a fool of an honest woman old enough to be thy mother. If thou comest a step nearer the house, there's a good horse-pool, and there's two stout fellows haul, like no better fun than ducking thee be off why thee. And she strode into her own premises, never looking round to see whether he obeyed her injunction or not. Sometimes 3 or 4 years would pass over without her hearing Michael Hurst's name mentioned. She used to wonder at such times whether he were dead or alive. She would sit for hours by the dying embers of her fire on a winter's evening, trying to recall the scenes of her youth, trying to bring up living pictures of the faces she had then known. Michael's most especially. She thought it was possible, so long had been the lapse of years, that she might now pass by him in the street unknowing, and unknown his outward form, she might not recognize, but himself, she should feel in the thrill of her whole being he could not pass her unawares. What little she did hear about him, all testified a downward tendency. He dran not at stated times, when there was no other work to be done, but continually, whether it was seed time or harvest. His children were all ill at the same time, then one died while the others recovered, but were poor sickly things. No one dared to give Susan any direct intelligence of her former lover. Many avoided all mention of his name in her presence, but a few spoke out either in indifference to or ignorance of those bygone days. Susan heard every word, every whisper, every sound that related to him, but her eye never changed, nor did a muscle of her face move. Late one November night, she sat over her fire, not a human being besides herself in the house, none. But she had ever slept there. Since Willie's death, the farm laborers had foddered the cattle, and gone home hours before. There were crickets chirping all round the warm hearthstones. There was the clock ticking with the peculiar beat Susan had known from her childhood, and which then, and ever since, she had oddly associated within the idea of a mother and child, talking together, one loud tick and quick, a feeble sharp one following. The day had been keen and piercingly cold. The whole lift of heaven seemed a dome of iron, black and frostbound. Was the earth under the cruel east wind? Now the wind had dropped, and as the darkness had gathered in the weatherwise old laborers prophesied snow, the sounds in the air arose again. As Susan sat still and silent, they were of a different character to what they had been during the prevalence of the east wind. Then they had been shrill and piping, now they were like low, distant growling, not unmusical, but strangely threatening. Susan went to the window and drew aside the little curtain. The whole world was whiteth, air was blinded with the swift and heavy fall of snow. At present it came down straight, but Susan knew those distant sounds in the hollows and gullies of the hills portended a driving wind, and a more cruel storm. She thought of her sheep, where they all folded the newborn calf. Was it bedded well before the drifts were formed too deep for her to pass in and out? And by the morning she judged that they would be 6 or 7 feet deep. She would go out and see, after the comfort of her beasts. She took a lantern, and tied a shawl over her head, and went out into the open air. She had tenderly provided for all her animals, and was returning when borne on the blast, as if some spirit crifer. It seemed to come rather down from the skies than from any creature standing on earth's levelsh. Heard a voice of agony. She could not distinguish words. It seemed rather as if some bird of prey was being caught in the whirl of the icy wind, and torn. And tortured by its violence again, up high above Susan put down her lantern, and shouted loud in return. It was an instinct. For if the creature were not human, which she had doubted but a moment before, what good could her responding cry do? And her cry was seized on by the tyrannous wind, and borne farther away in the opposite direction to that from which the call of agony had proceeded again. She listened no sound then again. It rang through space, and this time she was sure it was human. She turned into the house and heaped turf and wood on the fire, which, careless of her own sensations, she had allowed to fade and almost die out. She put a new candle in her lantern. She changed her shawl for a Maud, and leaving the door on latch, she sallied out just at the moment when her ear first encountered the weird noises of the storm. On issuing forth into the open air, she thought she heard the words, "O God, O help." They were a guide to her. If words they were, for they came straight from a rock, not a quarter of a mile from Eunuch, but only to be reached on account of its precipitous character. By a roundabout path thither she steered, defying wind and snow, guided by here a thorn tree, there an old doddered oak which had not quite lost their identity, under the whelming mask of snow now. And then she stopped to listen, but never a word or sound heard she till right from where the copsewood grew thick and tangled at the base of the rock round which she was winding. She heard a moan into the break-all snow, in appearance almost, a plain of snow, looked on from the little eminence where she stood plunged, breaking down the bush, stumbling, bruising herself, fighting her way, her lantern held between her teeth, and she herself using head as well as hands to butt away a passage at whatever cost of bodily injury as she climbed or staggered, owing to the unevenness of the snow-covered ground, where the briars and weeds of years were tangled and matted together. Her foot felt something strangely soft and yielding. She lowered her lantern. There lay a man prone on his face, nearly covered by the fast-falling flakes. He must have fallen from the rock above, as, not knowing of the circuitous path he had tried to descend its steep, slippery face. Who could tell it was no time for thinking? Susan lifted him up with her wiry strength. He gave no help, no sign of life. But for all that he might be alive, he was still warm. She tied her Maud round him. She fastened the lantern to her apron string. She held him tight, half gurrying, half dragging. What did a few bruises signify to him, compared to dear life, to precious life? She got him through the break, and down the path. There for an instant she stopped to take breath, but as if stung by the furies, she pushed on again with almost superhuman strength, clasping him round the waist, and, leaning his dead weight against the lintel of the door, she tried to undo the latch. But now, just at this moment, a trembling faintness came over her, and a fearful dread took possession of her that here, on the very threshold of her home, she might be found dead and buried under the snow. When the farm servants came in the morning, this terror stirred her up to one more effort. Then she and her companion were in the warmth of the quiet haven of that kitchen. She laid him on the settle, and sank on the floor by his side. How long she remained in this swoon she could not tell. Not very long, she judged by the fire, which was still red and sullenly glowing. When she came to herself, she lighted the candle, and bent over her late burden to ascertain if indeed he were dead. She stood long gazing. The man lay dead. There could be no doubt about it. His filmy eyes glared at her unshut. But Susan was not one to be affrighted by the stony aspect of death. It was not that, it was the bitter, woeful recognition of Michael Hurst. She was convinced he was dead, but after a while she refused to believe in her conviction. She stripped off his wet outer garments with trembling, hurried hands. She brought a blanket down from her own bed. She made up the fire. She swathed him in fresh, warm wrappings, and laid him on the flags before the fire, sitting herself at his head, and holding it in her lap, while she tenderly wiped his loose, wet hair, curly still, although its color had changed from nut-brown to iron gray since she had seen it last. From time to time, she bent over the face, afresh, sick and fain, to believe that the flicker of the firelight was some slight convulsive motion. But the dim staring eyes struck chill to her heart at last. She ceased her delicate, busy cares. But she still held the head softly. As if caressing it, she thought over all the possibilities and chances, in the mingled yarn of their lives, that might by so slight a turn have ended far otherwise if her mother's cold had been early tended, so that the responsibility as to her brother's weal or woe had not fallen upon her, if the fever had not taken such rough, cruel hold on. Well, nay, if Mrs. Gale, that hard, worldly sister, had not accompanied him on his last visit to you, Nookai's very last before this fatal stormy, might, if she had heard his crickery uttered by these pale, dead lips, with such wild, despairing agony, not yet 3 hours ago. Oh, if she had but heard it sooner, he might have been saved before that blind, false step had precipitated him down the rock. In going over this weary chain of unrealized possibilities, Susan learnt the force of Peggy's words. Life was short. Looking back upon it, it seemed but yesterday since all the love of her being had been poured out and run to waste. The intervening years, long monotonous years, that had turned her into an old woman before her time were but a dream. The laborers coming in the dawn of the winter's day were surprised to see the firelight through the low kitchen window. They knocked, and hearing a moaning answer they entered, fearing that something had befallen their mistress. For all explanation they got these words: "It is Michael Hurst, he was belated, and fell down the Raven's Crag, where does Eleanor his wife live." How Michael Hurst got to Eunuch no one but Susan ever knew. They thought he had dragged himself there, with some sore internal bruise, sapping away his minuted life. They could not have believed the superhuman exertion which had first sought him out, and then dragged him hither. Only Susan knew of that. She gave him into the charge of her servants, and went out and saddled her horse, where the wind had drifted the snow on one side, and the road was clear and bare. She rode, and rode fast, where the soft, deceitful heaps were massed up. She dismounted, and led her steed plunging in deep with fierce energy, the pain at her heart urging her onwards with a sharp digging spur. The grey solemn winter's noon was more night-like than the depth of summer's night. Dim purple brooded the low skies over the white earth, as Susan rode up to what had been Michael Hurst's abode. While living it was a small farmhouse carelessly kept outside, slatternly tended within. The pretty Nellie Hebthwaite was pretty still. Her delicate face had never suffered from any long-enduring feeling. If anything, its expression was that of plaintive sorrow. But the soft light hair had scarcely a tinge of gray. The wood-rose tint of complexion yet remained, if not so brilliant as in youth. The straight nose, the small mouth were untouched by time. Susan felt the contrast even at that moment. She knew that her own skin was weather-beaten, furrowed brown, that her teeth were gone, and her hair gray and ragged. And yet she was not 2 years older than Nellish had not been in youth. When she took account of these things, Nellie stood wondering at the strange enough horsewoman who stopped and panted at the door, holding her horse's bridle and refusing to enter. "Where is Michael Hurst?" asked Susan at last. "Well, I can't rightly say. He should have been at home last night, but he was off seeing after a public house to be let at Ulverstone, for our farm does not answer, and we were thinking." "He did not come home last night," said Susan, cutting short the story and half affirming, half questioning, by way of letting in a ray of the awful light, before she let it full in its consuming wrath. "No, hell be stopping somewhere out Ulverstone ways. I am sure we've need of him at home, for I've no one but Lyle Tommy to help me tend the beasts. Things have not gone well with us, and we don't keep a servant now, but you're a trembling all over, Mom. You'd better come in and take something warm while your horse rests. That's the stable door to your left." Susan took her horse there, loosened his girths, and rubbed him down with a wisp of straw. Then she hooked about her for hay, but the place was bare of feed and smelt damp. And unused, she went to the house, thankful for the respite, and got some clapbread, which she mashed up in a pailful of lukewarm water. Every moment was a respite, and yet every moment made her dread the more the task that lay before her. It would be longer than she thought at first. She took the saddle off and hung about her horse, which seemed somehow more like a friend than anything else in the world. She laid her cheek against its neck, and rested there before returning to the house for the last time. Eleanor had brought down one of her own gowns which hung on a chair against the fire, and had made her unknown visitor a cup of hot tea. Susan could hardly bear all these little attentions. They choked her. And yet she was so wet, so weak with fatigue and excitement, that she could neither resist by voice or by action. 2 children stood awkwardly about, puzzled at the scene, and even Eleanor began to wish for some explanation of who her strange visitor was. "You've maybe heard him speaking of me. I am called Susan Dixon." Nellie colored and avoided meeting Susan's eye. "I've heard other folks speak of you. He never named your name." This respective silence came like balm to Susan, balm not felt or heeded at the time it was applied, but very grateful in its effects for all that. "He is at my house," continued Susan, determined not to stop or quaver in the operation, the pain which must be inflicted. "At your house, Eunuch?" questioned Eleanor, surprised. "How came he there?" half jealously. "Did he take shelter from the coming storm? Tell Mether is something, tell me, woman." "He took no shelter, would to God he had." "Oh, would to God," shrieked out Eleanor, learning all from the woeful import of those dreary eyes. Her cries thrilled through the house. The children's piping wailings and passionate cries on "Daddy, Daddy" pierced into Susan's very marrow, but she remained as still and tearless as the great round face upon the clock. At last, in a lull of crying, she said, not exactly questioning, but as if partly to herself, "You loved him then?" "Loved him? He was my husband. He was the father of 3 bonny bairns that lie dead in Grasmere churchyard. I wished you'd go, Susan Dixon, and let me weep without your watching me. I wished you'd never come near the place." "Alas, alas, it would not have brought him to life. I would have laid down my own, To save his my life has been so very sad no one would have cared, if I had died alas alas. The tone in which she said this was so utterly mournful and despairing that it awed Nellie into quiet for a time, but by and by she said I would not turn a dog out to do it harm. But the night is clear, and Tommy shall guide you to the Red Cow. But oh, I want to be alone if y'all come back tomorrow, ill be better and ill hear all. And thank you for every kindness you have shown him, and I do believe you've showed him kindness, though I don't know why. Susan moved heavily and strangely. She said something, her words came thick and unintelligible. She had had a paralytic stroke since she had last spoken. She could not go even if she would, nor did Alina. When she became aware of the state of the case, wish her to leave. She had her laid on her own bed, and weeping silently all the while for her last husband. She nursed Susan like a sister. She did not know what her guest's worldly position might be, and she might never be repaid, but she sold many a little trifle to purchase such small comforts as Susan needed. Susan, lying still and motionless, learnt much. It was not a severe stroke, it might be the forerunner of others yet to come, but at some distance of time. But for the present she recovered and regained much of her former health on her sickbed. She matured her plans when she returned to Eunuch. She took Michael Hurst's widow and children with her to live there, and fill up the haunted hearth with living forms that should banish the ghosts. And so it fell out that the latter days of Susan Dixon's life were better than the former.